Welcome to Awesome Movie Year, the podcast where we take a look back at an awesome year for movies, which is every year. I'm Josh Bell, film critic and writer, and I'm joined by my co-host.
I'm Jason Horace, filmmaker, comedian, and I'm exhausted from rescuing Josh from a Mexican general.
Well, exhausted or perhaps dead, maybe, is what you are, if we're referencing this movie properly. Spoiler alert there for the film we're about to discuss. In this season of Awesome Movie Year, we are talking about the films of 1969, and we're here at Jason's pick. So what did you pick, Jason?
Josh, I picked The Wild Bunch, Sam Peckinpah, a film I had never seen because I'm wild like this bunch, Josh. I'll take risks on my picks. There was really nothing that spoke to me. I wanted to check out beyond this one, and I am a big Sam Peckinpah fan, so this was a natural fit for this one.
Jason loves picking movies with the word wild in the title that he's seen before for his pick. Right. But I'm hoping this worked out better for you than The Wild One, which you had picked in 1953 and was not your favorite from that.
No, but you know what? It was an important movie to watch. And, what's so interesting about The Wild Bunch is like you watch the movie and then you research it and you're like, oh, this movie is so far ahead of everything that we had expected. It's kind of like that crop duster scene in North by Northwest, right? Like when you first study it as like a film person, right? You're like, oh, that looks cool. That's amazing. Great. And then you're like, no, wait a second. There had never been anything on film like this before, right? And then with The Wild Bunch, you're watching these shootouts and these quick cuts and all this. And you're like, oh, that's a really amazing action sequence. But then you're like, oh, wait a second. No one had ever done anything like this before.
Yeah, revolutionary approach to action here with the quick cuts, like you said, and the mix of slow-mo and regular speed shots. Perhaps a later influence on Zack Snyder, even.
I was going to go with Tarantino, who we know he's an influence on.
That too, yes, yeah.
But not better just choice. That, Josh, the first film ever to have different sound effects for the different guns that were being fired.
Was it the first film ever or just the first like Warner Brothers film? I wasn't sure. I read that the studio had that live.
Just go with my thing. It sounds way better.
I'm not sure. You might be right. You might be right. Then maybe I misunderstood. But yeah, revolutionary for that reason. And its depiction of violence. This is just as the rating system is coming into play. I believe, as we talked about, I think a bunch in our 1967 season, that was when the production code ended. And so with the implementation of the R rating, it was possible to release a movie like this that was so violent and label it rated R so that it was restricted, but you could do it. Whereas before you could never do something like this. So that is a level of freedom that Peckinpah had in making this movie that people wouldn't have had before.
Right. And a lot of those, this is already a long movie, but there's like the director's cut, which is an extra 10 minutes and it wasn't even violent, but they wouldn't let him release it as is. So, he went back and, as we were saying, intercut some shots from different scenes into the opening montage to get it down. And they gave him an R rating, but who cares? The ratings are so stupid.
Right. Well, the editing, I think, was not as much about the rating as it was about, because as you said, it's a long movie, being able to show it more times.
I think it was both elements. Why do you keep negating everything I'm saying?
I know. I'm just trying to. I'm
going to give you back to that Mexican general, Josh.
And that director's cut, which is what people generally watch now, was released in Europe in 1969. So some audiences did get the chance to see that original cut, but here in the U.S., we had to be protected from the full vision of Sam Peckinpah.
Right. Why would we try to stop violence in real life when we can stop Sam Peckinpah's violent screen nature?
Yes, but either way, it was a successful film. It grossed $11 million on its budget of $6 million and was nominated for 2 Oscars for Best Original Screenplay and for Best Original Score. But it was certainly controversial, and that extends to the critics as well. Even the positive reviews kind of get into that. A lot of them compare it to Bonnie and Clyde, which of course we discussed in an episode in our 1967 season, and the violence that was shocking to audiences in that film 2 years earlier. The violence here also shocking and controversial. But for the most part, critics seem to respond positively to other aspects of the film. Vincent Canby in the New York Times said, "The movie is very beautiful and the first truly interesting American-made Western in years. It's also so full of violence, of an intensity that can hardly be supported by the story, that it's going to prompt a lot of people who do not know the real effect of movie violence, as I do not, to write automatic condemnations of it. The Wild Bunch takes the basic elements of the Western movie myth, which once defined a simple, morally comprehensible world, and by bending them, turns them into symbols of futility and aimless corruption. Although the movie's conventional and poetic action sequences are extraordinarily good, and its landscapes beautifully photographed, it is most interesting in its almost jolly account of chaos, corruption, and defeat. All personal relationships in the movie seem somehow perverted in odd mixtures of noble sentimentality, greed, and lust."
So to dissect a lot of that, Josh, I was looking up Oscar nominations. I don't know how they could have left Lucien Ballard, the cinematographer of this thing, off of the the Oscar nominations for this year. He did win the National Society of Film Critics Award for Best Cinematography. So as far as these relationships go, I mean, I watched the Oscar-nominated short film, The Wild Bunch, an album and montage, and I, did a lot of research because I come prepped, ready to rock, Josh, ready to rescue from those Mexican huertas. There's the whole theme. That's part of the fun of this also, is reading about the themes of like, hey, this is a story about men who are out of time, right? This is the end of that style of life. They're a little too late for it. So those relationships, I think, bonded them together. But I didn't think anything was like perverse or, off-putting or anything like that. These are outlaws who find a cause in the end, right? And that's kind of what, Peckinpah himself said. So many Westerns had tried to do that and they hadn't been able to crack that code, but this one did.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know if the relationships are perverse or whatever, but it did strike me, especially this time, is that all of these people are awful and they're not redeemed to me in any way. And that's good about the movie. I think, like showing the violence and how disturbing it is and how horrifying it would be to witness, the idea that these are not good people generally. And for the most part, they don't do the right thing. And when they do, it doesn't really work out, and they don't really do it with the proper preparation or conviction or whatever. So there is the camaraderie of their relationships, right? Especially between William Holden's character and Ernest Borgnine's character, the kind of the leader of the bunch and his second in command or whatever. They clearly have a lot of affection and respect for each other. So I wouldn't call the relationships perverse or whatever, but I think the overall tone of the movie is very nihilistic, and the people themselves are not the kind of admirable Western heroes that we're used to. As he's saying here, it takes those elements of Westerns and kind of twists them around and makes this a movie about corruption and about violence and death and indiscriminate just killing. So it is interesting that he says these action sequences are conventional, though, because, of course, as you pointed out, they're definitely not. And in addition to the cinematography, you would think that the editing maybe would have warranted some awards attention, but not that either.
I would have thought that, Josh. I do understand what you're saying, and I agree with you that, these aren't the good guys. There are no good guys in this movie, and I'm okay with that. I like that stuff, right? These are our protagonists, and that's who we're following. And they made, especially like you said, Holden and Borgnine, they made for like a riveting pair of protagonists. So I was into it. The editor is Lou Lombardo, Josh.
Yeah, and excellent work from him. So Pauline Kael in The New Yorker said, "It's a traumatic poem of violence with imagery as ambivalent as Goya's. Peckinpah has very intricate, contradictory feelings, and he got so wound up in the aesthetics of violence that what had begun as a realistic treatment, a deglamorization of warfare that would show how horribly gruesome killing really is, became instead an almost abstract fantasy about violence. The bloody deaths are voluptuous, frightening, beautiful. Pouring new wine into the bottle of the Western, Peckinpah explodes the bottle. His story is too simple for this imagist epic. And it's no accident that you feel a sense of loss for each killer of the bunch. Peckinpah has made them seem heroically, mythically alive on the screen.
Well, you know, the point there that I gravitated towards, which I kept reading about over and over, was that Peckinpah didn't want to, you know, kind of dumb down what it's like to die in such a gruesome manner in a shootout. He wanted to show that just how violent and you know, devastating that is. And you know, I don't know. I'm. It's interesting to read all these reviews about, like, you know, to hear these pieces on like, oh, the character's this, the character's that. I guess I just went along with the ride.
Yeah, I mean, I think it does do a good job of showing you how horrific it would be to actually be in a shootout. I don't necessarily agree with Pauline Kael here that it eventually becomes kind of abstract. I mean, you could argue that there's so much of it that by the end it's sort of numbing as a viewer, that shocking effect has worn off. But I think it's pretty strong. And I definitely disagree with her, as I was just saying, that these characters seem heroic. Or I mean, they're likable in a way because the actors are good, but I definitely didn't mourn their deaths in any way, in, you know, and certainly not in the same way that I might in a movie about like a more upstanding kind of protagonist.
Did you feel differently at the end of Butch Cassidy and the Sundance Kid?
Yeah, I mean, well, Butch Cassidy obviously has this kind of, I mean, I guess maybe it's not really ambiguous, right? Because it's pretty obvious what's going to happen, but it does stop before that moment of violence. And I think with that, you have this sort of wistful feeling, right? Is that you have really liked spending time with those characters, and they're aware of what their fate is going to be, and they're kind of going into it with their eyes open, and it's bittersweet because it seems like this is how they want to go out, but you're sad that they're going to be gone. And whereas with these characters you feel like all of the violence on all sides in this movie is so senseless that there's no noble sacrifice involved here in any way.
Well, yeah, it's a fait accompli, right? This lifestyle is going to lead to this. And, you know, I think, you know, when I was talking about that documentary, an album and montage, they were saying, you know, those kind of moments at the end when they realize, yeah, we're going to die, but we're dying for a cause. But also, hey, this is the end we all signed up for. It's almost like a relief to them. It's kind of an interesting thing to ruminate on.
Yeah, I mean, but I wonder, it's like, do they even really die for a cause? I mean, we're getting right here into the ending, but do they accomplish anything by sacrificing themselves at the end? And I would argue that they don't, and that's part of the point, that everything they do is futile. That, you know, all of the terrible things they do are futile. And then when at the very end they come around to doing sort of the right thing or whatever, it doesn't help either. And it just leads to more senseless violence, and it leads to more people being killed by being caught in the crossfire.
So in the end, they go back to the village where they're kind of, you know, hiding out, I'd say. Angel's village, who's one of their members, and Angel shoots and kills his ex-fiance, possibly aiming for the general who she's now with. And they torture him. And some of the most like effective kind of torture sequences I've seen on film, where they're dragging him from the back of a car, which is not only brutal, but also like ingenious the way it's set up, because this is 1913 and this is the first time, you know, they have conversations of like, this is the first time they're seeing a car. So to utilize that beyond just like, in Butch Cassidy, for instance, right, where they're, oh, it's a bicycle, it's the thing of the future, right? And then we just have a montage. This actually has more of a purpose of that. But so that shootout, when they go to get him and everyone just kills everyone, there were like 350 extras, Josh, and they had about 6,000 deaths. So it was like really the whole idea of, hey, kids, let's put on a show. Someone would get shot, the squib would go off, they'd go to like a staging area, they'd paint over the squib and like dirty up the uniform to make them look a little different, and then put them back out in the scene. Really just kind of innovative. And I noticed, like, because you're talking about a lot of the, you know, themes on screen, and I'm really fascinated by like the technical elements. So I'm wondering if that kind of, shaded our enjoyment in different ways.
Well, maybe. I mean, and it certainly is an impressive technical achievement. I mean, you watch those giant set pieces, and there's, I would say, like three kind of central ones. There's the bank robbery gone wrong at the beginning, and there's the big train robbery in the middle, and then there's that shootout at the end that you're talking about. And it is impressive to think about how much logistically would have gone into putting those scenes together. And absolutely, I think about that. But I mean, I think it's all in service of the story that he's trying to tell and the themes that he's trying to explore. And so that's what it kind of comes back to for me.
I agree with you, but it's all there for a reason. So
yeah.
I mean, like I said, I'm a big Peckinpah guy, and I haven't seen a ton of his movies, but I really, really love kind of learning more about him.
Yeah. So finally, on the very negative end, Judith Crist in New York Magazine, she said, and this is sort of transitioning from something else, she said, "Nor is William Holden faring better at the hands of Sam Peckinpah, whose directorial hallmark seems to me to be incoherence of narrative amid buckets of blood. The Wild Bunch is a bit of Western nostalgia about a gang of overage bad guys operating north and south of the border circa 1913. Fleeing from Texas railroad-employed bounty hunters and dealing in guns with Mexican bandit generals. The film starts off with a bloody shoot-up in a Texas town and winds up with a shoot-down of the good bad guys and the bad ones in a Mexican town that is the bloodiest and most sickening display of slaughter that I can recall seeing in a theatrical film. And quotes attributed to Mr. Holden that this sort of ultraviolence is a healthy purgative for viewers are just about as sick. If you must see the Wild Bunch, be sure to take along a barf bag." So she didn't like it.
Oh my, I must clutch my pearls at the very moment of the shootout here.
Yeah.
I mean, I just look, we talk about this all the time, right? Like, it's just, Dave and I especially love these kind of like ultra violent movies. We have no desire to be involved with or perform violence in real life. And I get, that's a narrative on movies like this, but I look at it just as like, this is, this is gun ballet, right? Like that kind of John Wick stuff that we talk about and everything. But on top of that, like, dude, you're going to knock William Holden in this movie? He's fascinating as the lead.
He is. And to your point about violence, elsewhere in Vincent Canby's review, he talks about that. And, in the part I quoted, he basically said, like, I don't really know, what is actually the effect of movie violence. But then at the end, he says, like, for the record, when I left this movie, I didn't want to kill anyone or something along those lines. So, people are definitely dealing with that discourse at this time. But I did find it amusing to get, because it certainly wasn't universally positive, the way that this is sort of considered this great classic now. And, the barf bag line is pretty good. So
yeah,
I had to get that in there.
No, I know you're right. I mean, I think the Bonnie and Clyde, Peckinpah himself said that was influential on him. And this is like ratcheted up even more because, like you mentioned, those three set pieces. The first one is so disorienting. That's the opening scene. And I'm like, wait a second, who's a good guy? Who's a bad guy? Who's trying to kill who? Why are they trying to kill each other? But I think that's the point of it, right? Like, you're just thrown into the gunfight at the beginning, and then it all kind of unfurls from there.
Right. And I mean, the thing about that scene, too, if you're wondering who are the good guys and who are the bad guys, like, they're all just shooting bystanders indiscriminately. Yeah. And it's, immediately you're like, oh, no one here is a good guy. Nobody cares. Nobody values human life in this film. It's all just about, getting paid or revenge or whatever. But no one's a good guy.
Right. Doing the bidding of the railroad man, right?
Yeah.
So, that could be the same thing today, doing the bidding of Bezos.
Yeah, his private mercenary force, which he probably does have, right?
We hope.
As long as my packages arrive on time.
Yeah, somebody having a shootout outside your house to keep
What'd you get? What's the last thing you ordered, Dave?
I'm on Subscribe and Save. I get so much stuff. Dog food, pills, everything.
All right. So, Jason, you had not seen this before, but you say you're a Peckinpah fan, so I assume you'd seen a bunch of other films of his.
I'm not going to say a bunch. I had seen Straw Dogs, which I think is the masterpiece of Peckinpah, and I had seen The Getaway, and I'd read the Tarantino book, which has a cool chapter on The Getaway. So, I mean, I'm way behind. I did watch The Killer Elite this week, so I think I'm about a third of the way through the Peckinpah canon, but Straw Dogs was the one that I first saw where I'm like, yo, who is this guy? And The Wild Bunch had been on my watch list for a while. So I'm glad we got to it.
Yeah, me too. I mean, I had seen it several years ago just as a major, a notable film to see, and really was impressed by it at that time. And I tend to be less into these like super macho directors necessarily, like Peckinpah, but I do enjoy his films. I mean, I had seen Straw Dogs and some other Westerns of his, Pat Garrett and Billy the Kid, and Bring Me the Head of Alfredo Garcia. And I watched Ride the High Country this week, as well as The Getaway, which I quite like The Getaway. So, I mean, I think he's very talented. I think sometimes this kind of really macho bluster or whatever can get exhausting. But from someone who is doing it in a thoughtful way, which I think at his best Peckinpah is doing, like someone like Michael Mann, it's really fascinating. So, I've seen 5 or 6 of his movies or whatever now, and I'm generally impressed with what he does.
Yeah, no, those are good points. I mean, there's a purpose to that machismo, right? And like you hear it in the lines and the way they talk to each other. And that's one of the elements I really enjoyed. Like, whether you agree with them or not, they are principled in their machismo, and it comes across in the characters.
Right. And then there are flaws there that I'm sure we'll get into. But yeah, overall, I think he backs that up. It's not just this sort of empty, chauvinism or whatever. So, Dave, had you seen this before?
I had not, but I did also watch Straw Dogs this week in preparation for this. But yeah, I mean, great stuff all around with everything I've seen from him so far.
Yeah. I've seen the Straw Dogs remake as well. Not as good.
Boy.
Oh yeah, what the move from Dustin Hoffman to James Marsden didn't really work out. Josh, is
no. James Marsden, I feel like, has found his place since then, but it was not being Dustin Hoffman and Straw Dogs.
Well, I mean, no, it's an interesting point because, like, when you're doing the research, you're figuring like you're gonna, and there's so many stories of for the Wild Bunch of like almost remakes of it, right? But maybe you don't need to remake movies. Let these like live where they belong.
Yes, absolutely. So, anything else you want to mention about the background of this movie, Jason?
Peckinpah said, of all the projects I have ever worked on, this is the closest to me. When it wrapped and everyone left, he just broke down and wept. There are 145 deaths in this movie, Josh. So that's a nice stat for you. But I found this quote from Scorsese and Jay Cox, right? They saw a screening of it and, before it was out. And the quote was, "We were mesmerized by it. It was obviously a masterpiece. It was real filmmaking using film in such a way that no other form could do it. It couldn't be done any other way. To see that in an American filmmaker was so exciting," which is what I think Scorsese said. And Cox said that he and Scorsese literally turned to each other at the end and were stunned. "We were looking at each other, shaking our heads like we had just come out of a shared fever dream."
I mean, it would certainly be a startling thing to watch at the time, again, because so much of what it's doing is revolutionary that we maybe take a little for granted now. So I can imagine that being the case.
Yeah, and I think that's so cool. And, you think of, certain Scorsese films, but I'm glad you brought up Michael Mann because, the shootout in Heat, which is a masterful shootout, really kind of resonates back towards this.
Yeah, I mean, he's the one that I think of most in terms of the sort of the new, not the Michael Mann.
The new wave of 80-year-old filmmakers, Josh.
Right. But if the person carrying on that Peckinpah tradition or whatever is that he's the one that comes to mind. But there's others too. Maybe we'll talk about it later. But for now, we'll come back and get into our general thoughts on The Wild Bunch. Welcome back to Awesome Movie Year. In this episode of our season on the films of 1969, we are talking about Jason's pick, The Wild Bunch. And Jason, you're pleased with your pick, even though you hadn't seen this before, right?
Good job, Jason.
Yeah, way to go. All right.
No, I was going to watch it eventually anyway, right? So it makes sense. And, I'm thinking of this year, 69, we've already covered Butch Cassidy, right? And now, John Wayne won the Oscar for True Grit, right? So, and now you have The Wild Bunch. These are like 3 iconic Westerns that kind of take the form a little differently, right? So it's an interesting year for Westerns, but I would say at the beginning, right, where you're like kind of disoriented, it takes a minute to kind of get into it other than the action part of it. But beyond that, like it's a long movie and it feels like a long movie, but is that a negative I'm not saying it's a positive, but it didn't negate my enjoyment from it. I'm just saying like it's a little exhaustive.
It is. I mean, and I think maybe that's part of the point, just like with the violence, the idea that this is not a fun place to be, really. And it kind of wears these people down, whether they're the outlaws that are our main characters, or just, again, especially like the people trying to go about their lives and not get murdered in the street or whatever. It's rough. So I think that's maybe part of the purpose. But yeah, it felt long to me. I think maybe more so than the first time I saw it. I was feeling like it was a bit of a chore to get through at times, but it is a really good movie. I mean, I wouldn't say that it isn't. And I think especially with that, when it begins, I was like, oh wow, right. This movie is amazing. And then it kind of slows itself at different points. But that opening shootout is so fantastic. And it really establishes so many of those themes. Again, like you were talking about before, like who is the good guy and who is the bad guy. And we have the introduction with like, you see the children who are sort of sadistically cheering on the like ants and scorpions that they've pitted against each other and just rooting for death. And the idea of, we see children as bystanders and participants throughout this film, and the idea of this kind of perpetuation of violence generationally is a big theme here. And then, of course, also the idea of people being caught in the crossfire, and we have this parade of the Temperance League that's advocating against strong drink or whatever, and they're being used as cover for the theoretical escape of the Wild Bunch from this bank. But really what they're being used for is
human
cannon
shield.
fodder. Right, exactly. So. I mean, we get a literal human shield moment in the final shootout, but still here, yes, exactly. They're the barrier between the two gangs that just gets obliterated.
Right. So the Wild Bunch is being tracked by a posse of paid off, perhaps hooligans. Perhaps they're all hooligans. Let's call them that. Right.
They are.
So, and that's by the railroad man Harrigan, right? Which was in Butch Cassidy. Was it Harriman? And now this is Harrigan.
Oh, yeah, I think so. I wonder if it's based on a real person, that they both just had slight variations on the name.
Yeah, it feels like there was there will be blood Harrigan type character in here, right? So, and that's being led by Robert Ryan, who plays Deke Thornton, who is William Holden's old partner. And when the cops got him surrounded, Holden escapes, and he still feels badly about it. But Ryan goes to jail. And this is his way out of jail if he can track the Wild Bunch, and he's on a ticking clock of 30 days. So that all works. I do think, when we're talking about introducing so many characters, we get to know the Wild Bunch so much better than we get to know the Deke Thornton character. And I could see that as a negative on this thing.
Yeah, it is a bit confusing. I mean, in a weird way, it helps that so many people get killed in the opening scene, because as the movie was opening, the Wild Bunch is much bigger at the beginning of the movie than it is after that first sequence. And I was like, oh man, there's so many people, and who are all of these? And then most of them just get murdered. And so you don't have to worry about who they are. And as like you said, you do get to know the remaining members of the Wild Bunch pretty well. We've got William Holden's character Pike, and then Ernest Borgnine as his kind of lieutenant, and these two brothers. And then the grizzled old the kind of support guy. Yeah, exactly. Who's waiting for them at their getaway spot. And then Angel, the young Mexican guy. So, I mean, those characters are pretty well defined over time. And we get those flashbacks with Robert Ryan's character, but the flashbacks are a bit cheesy. That's one of the elements that I didn't think was quite as effective as it could have been. And you're right, though. Even though we get that and we kind of understand his relationship to William Holden, we don't know as much about him as I feel like we would or should. And a different version of this movie could have been a more balanced back and forth between those two characters.
And I think that's what it would be if any of these remakes ever went through, right? So the cat and mouse of the whole thing. But Josh, I want to go back to what you were saying about that opening sequence of the ants eating the scorpion, right? So,
Yes.
so for one, thematically, you're right. Like it plays such a huge part into like the violent nature of humans, and it's really like, I mean, that's, if not the first image, one of the first images you see. So right away as a viewer, you're like so off put, right? Like it's like it shakes you in the balance of the whole thing. But what I thought was so interesting in watching that little documentary, not little, but that short documentary, and reading about it was that wasn't part of this script. And there are so many things when you research this movie that weren't part of the script that someone brought up, like, hey, when I was a kid, we used to do this. And Peckinpah's like, whoa, that is the perfect theme to start the movie. So he's like not just rewriting the script as he's going, like the famous sequences of them walking out of the village or walking back into the village for the final shootout. None of that is scripted. That's just Peckinpah saying, like, in my mind, I know what this is supposed to be. We're going to take a day and shoot this. And that is, I mean, he's a genius, right? Like to be able to pull that off. And, you know, for an actor, we know he was demanding and abusive, if we're going to be honest, right? But a lot of these actors have so much respect and love for him because he's putting in so much of himself into the movie and keeping the actors on their toes. He's a fascinating character in that way.
Yeah, I mean, and it is impressive the way all of that stuff is put together, and the cross-cutting in that opening between the shots of the kids and the ants and the scorpions, and then the wild bunch coming into town and getting into the bank and all of that stuff. And it really emphasizes the connections between those things. And yeah, I mean, this is the script, I'm sure, was good. And Peckinpah is, we should say, also credited as a co-writer here. So, you know, he contributed to that in that phase as well. But visually and structurally, and that's why I mentioned the editing before too, this is such an impressively constructed film. And even if there are these lulls, like we said, and it feels like it's long at times, all of that is deliberate to build the effect that Peckinpah wants.
Right. I mean, you mentioned the editing, and like, you know, all of this editing is so influential. Like, you know, I didn't know who Lou Lombardo was before this. Why don't I hear about him in the same way I hear about like Thelma Schoonmaker or something like that, right? So, you know, we're talking about the way it's shot, right? It's anamorphic and telephoto. So you're getting these like kind of long blown out shots and all this where everyone's in the foreground, right? Everyone's in focus, but you're getting all this action crisscrossing. And, you know, so what you're saying is like those kind of nights in the open range are offset by this like chaotic frenzy of activity in all the shootouts. And when the Wild Bunch is, you know, quote unquote working, right? It is dizzying in some ways.
It is. And I mean, one of the things that he does in that opening shootout and then in the final one is there are all these really quick cuts and it feels chaotic, like you said, and it's disorienting. And I feel like in a lot of modern action movies, we would criticize something like that because it's like, oh, you can't tell what's going on or you don't know where people are in relation to each other. But what Peckinpah is doing that in a very deliberate way to say, yeah, that's true. You as a viewer, you can't necessarily tell what's going on or where people are in relation to each other because that's a reflection of what it's like to be in the middle of this.
Right.
And he's doing it in a much more careful, thought through way than almost any modern filmmaker, certainly any big blockbuster filmmaker would do.
I think you're right. And also, you know, you're talking about those edits and you had mentioned it's not just intercutting shots from different scenes or different spaces, different angles. It's different speeds, right? Like, so you're seeing a slow-mo followed by a normal speed, followed by a slow-mo, by a, you know, a sped up shot. And it's like, it's all there to, you know, like we said, keep you from feeling comfortable within the setting, right? As a viewer, you're like you're saying, you're in the middle of the battle. And like, that's the mastery. That's why when I mentioned Straw Dogs, which is a slow boil to that Act 3, and then Act 3 happens and you're like, this might be the Wild Bunch taken to the next level in that third act, right? So it all kind of builds and builds and builds. And that's why I think Tarantino is such a good reference point to this. Obviously, you know, you see those, the gang walking in and it's the Reservoir Dogs shot and all this and that. And, you know, Scorsese, Michael Mann, all these guys, you know, if you're going to learn from a master, this is a good one to do it.
Yeah, I mean, and I think we should also say that, the sort of third major set piece, the one in the middle of the movie, which is the train robbery, is kind of the opposite, right? That's not full of quick cuts. That's not this disorienting experience. And so when he's depicting that, which is this very methodical process for the gang where they actually have this very detailed plan that works, and it involves, specific movements, and they're trying to keep quiet, so it's a lot of just motions to each other. You have a very good sense of where everyone is and what they're doing and why, and he plays that out slowly and carefully because that's the right way to approach that scene, and the other approach is right for those other scenes.
That's a really exciting sequence, especially where Ernest Borgnine's character like almost falls through the two cars. And what it ends with is not just the robbery, but the chase, the posse chasing the Wild Bunch. And the Wild Bunch blows up a bridge, right, to get them so they can't cross it. That bridge, they had one take to do that in. So he shot with like 6 cameras, and and it's one of the most memorable, scenes in the movie, which makes it one of the most memorable scenes in, film history, right? And, there's 5 stuntmen on the bridge playing the posse with horses, and you see the bridge blow up, and the stuntmen and the horses fall into the water. Thankfully, no one was injured, but that was a low, that river was so low as far as the water flow, they had to dam it weeks ahead just so there would be enough water to make it safe for the fall.
Yeah, it's crazy. I mean, all this logistical stuff, like you were saying, is quite impressive. And then the bottom line, of course, is that it works for the movie, that you watch the movie and that sequence is really exciting. And we have that sort of ticking clock element where they light the fuse and the bridge is going to blow up, and then they get stuck. Their wagon is stuck in a rut, and they have to get off the bridge before it blows up because they're trying to escape. And and you're rooting for them. And this is another thing that goes back to is that Peckinpah creates these scenarios in which you do kind of want to root for the Wild Bunch, and you almost forget these people are terrible. They're no better than the people that are chasing them. Their goals that they're trying to achieve here are not noble or honorable in any way, and they're not going to kind of do the right thing here by anyone. And so it's impressive that Peckinpah still gets you engaged in that way, and then the performances too, that they make these characters people you want to spend time with.
There's I was thinking about this, William Holden, right? I don't want to say he's lost the time. He's a legend, right? But like, if you look at the work from Sunset Boulevard to Network, like, come on, man, right? This is in between. He's got a Best Oscar Actor Award for Stalag 17. And then I do think somehow along the line, we've underrated Ernest Borgnine. We've talked about him before and From Here to Eternity, but like, he's such a big, gruff kind of character that like, he was like an easy, punchline, like Abe Vigoda or something like that, right? But like, you're like, dude, Best Actor for Marty. He's doing this. Like, he's From Here to Eternity. He's got tons of amazing movies on his belt. And the two of them have a real kind of, electricity between them. And like, you do believe that they will stick each other's necks out for one another all the time. There's a scene where they're talking about like, I can't believe that Robert Ryan's character is chasing us. And William Holden says, well, he gave him his word, right? And then like, he's like, that doesn't mean anything. And Holden goes, it's his word, right? And he says it in such a unique and like vibrant tone. And then Borgnine fires back, it's not his word that matters. It's who you give it to. And I just like watched that back again because I was like, what an electric performance between these two.
Right. And I mean, and that shows that these guys theoretically have this kind of code of honor in some way. And I think that's familiar to us from a lot of Westerns. We expect that if there's an outlaw character that is the protagonist of a movie like this, that they're going to have some sort of honor that transcends the law, that we're going to find admirable. And that kind of is what goes on. But again, it's all in service of just terrible stuff. So I think it's impressive, though, like you said, that we really care about that, especially that relationship. That really is the central relationship rather than what you would imagine would be the central relationship between William Holden and Robert Ryan, these old friends who, one has kind of betrayed the other. We don't care as much about that. But the relationship between Holden and Ernest Borgnine is really strong there. And I think it is definitely to their credit that works so well.
Yeah, that Ryan and Holden relationship, we literally just mentioned Heat a few minutes ago, right? It could have had that kind of De Niro, Pacino type feeling. Fun fact, because like we said, Peckinpah was not one afraid to fuck with his actors, right? Robert Ryan complained about his billing, like he wasn't top billed here. So in the opening sequences, right, like you get, when it says William Holden and he's introduced, it's on his face, right? Ernest Borgnine on his face is the credit. When it's Robert Ryan's turn, they put a shot of horses' asses in there.
Yeah, I was wondering because that it has those two, as you say, at first, and I thought, is this going to be these freeze frames? Was it every actor? And it's not just Robert Ryan, but all the other later actors are shown their names on freeze frames with other shots. But yeah, I didn't quite get that. But that's a great sequence too, the way those credits play out. And each credit comes as there's this freeze frame and it shifts to like this kind of negative space looking black and white shot. And it culminates with Peckinpah's credit where the Wild Bunch has now gotten into the bank and you hear William Holden say, if they move, kill them. And then freeze frame, directed by Sam Peckinpah.
Yeah.
And
perfect,
right. And I think that's also, again, at the beginning where you're kind of trying to get your bearings and who are these guys and what is their deal. The fact that he just like says that, like, we don't try not to hurt the hostages, don't worry, everything, like, no, just kill them. We don't care about these people at all.
Right. And, we were talking about Holden and all these, different things like Sabrina, right? A Bridge Over the River Kwai, but like, there's no reason that he couldn't have been a Charles Bronson or something like that if he wanted to be, right? Like he's such a powerful presence on screen. And the other thing I wanted to say about Peckinpah is like, he was in director's jail basically at this point in time. He was, this was his first movie in a few years. He was doing TV work. And like, I think like, I admire the fact that like, he's like, hey, this is my first shot back and maybe my last shot back. So I'm going to give everything I have to it.
Right. And rather than just kind of making it this conventional Western that it might have been conceived as originally with the script, just so that he can kind of do the job and get back on track or whatever, he is radically reinventing things because that's what interests him. And that's definitely admirable. And it worked out. Obviously.
That's so cool, right? 1,288 camera setups, 333,000 feet of film shot.
Yeah, it's quite an achievement. So I feel like can we talk a little bit about the treatment of women in this film?
We can, but I'm a little disappointed, Josh, that you didn't go down to the two guys in the posse who made it their backstory that they were in a homosexual relationship. Because
they're brothers, Jason.
No, yeah. Josh, the two guys. No, that you're talking about the two guys in the Wild Bunch.
Yeah,
I'm talking about the two guys in the posse.
Oh, okay. Wait, which guys are these?
TC and Strother Martin Coffer. They made their own backstory that they.
Oh, the actors did.
Yeah.
Oh, okay.
Yeah. So they made their own backstory that their characters were lovers, and that's why when he's like, "You're a black liar," right? He's like, "You shouldn't talk to me like that." He goes, "Yeah, I'm sorry." Like they had their own subtext to it and everything.
I don't think that comes across in the subtext really. I mean, if I hadn't known that the actors had determined that, I would not have guessed that. I was thinking that you were referring to the brothers in the Wild Bunch itself who talk about how they're always going whoring together and they're doing the whores in tandem. And if you don't know that they're brothers, you might wonder, like, why are they doing all these things together?
No, I hear what you're saying there. But, there's that whole element. There's that sequence where they're with the prostitutes and they're shooting up the tequila stills. That was pretty interesting. Good sequence, I thought. So
yeah. I mean, I think as almost always with Peckinpah, he's not really interested in female characters. Although there are some. I mean, The Getaway has Ali MacGraw as a prominent character who gets dimensions, but certainly no one here does. But I did appreciate that. Like, okay, we're not going to have female characters as like characters with any sort of dimension to them or whatever, but he does consistently emphasize the fact that wherever they are, women are around and they're victims, right? That you talk about who are the bystanders here, who are the people who are getting stuck with the the outcome of violence between these men, and it's women. And I mean, it was really emphasized, I think, in that sequence that you were talking about earlier, where Angel, the Mexican member of the Wild Bunch, sees that his ex of some kind, right, has now, after the general attacked the village and killed people, including Angel's father, right, and this woman has decided to go off with the general and is now sort of like one of his, concubines or something like that. And he's very mad about this. And when he sees her, he gets really upset, and she goes and she's like canoodling there with the general, and he can't stop himself and he kills her. And so, all the general and all his bodyguards and whatever are suddenly jumping up, and they're pointing guns at the Wild Bunch. And, it seems like, oh, this is bad for our guys here. And the way they diffuse the situation is saying, whoa, hold on, General. He wasn't trying to kill you. He just wanted to kill that lady. And then General's like, ha, 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 oh, okay, no problem. Like, no, you're just killing a lady, whatever, it doesn't matter. Let's all be friends. And that to me was like, the emblematic of how these people treat women.
Yeah, I mean, okay, sure, I agree, but also it's not just them. It's you're talking about like almost like a dictator of a small town there, right? So I'm sure that character, it's just one of my many concubines, right? Like, well, just go rob a train for me. We'll call it even, that type of thing. So I'm not disagreeing with you. I'm just saying that yes, they were thought less of in this film than the men.
Right. But I think it's not even as much that they're thought less of by the film. I think Peckinpah is giving you that moment to show how these people treat women, how the characters treat women, and he's showing you like, hey, this is their attitude, right? This is I'm taking time to have this moment to demonstrate how people, and like you on both sides, right? The general and all of his men, the Wild Bunch, basically everyone in this world, this is how women are treated.
Yeah, I think that's fair. I mean, the Wild Bunch, I could argue they used it as a way to get out of a shootout there, because we do see them resort to tactics like that. Like, for instance, when Dutch and Angel go back and into the village to deliver their weapons, and the generals found out that Angel has kind of stolen a crate of weapons, even though he was given to him to give to the peasants to rise up against them. And Dutch has a chance where he could defend him, and he knows if he does, he'll probably end up dead. So he says, well, he's a thief, do with him as you want. And that's how we get to the car dragging scene and the eventual conclusion of the Wild Bunch going back to end things with the general.
Right. I mean, and it shows their kind of heartlessness for the most part, right? Early, at least initially, where Dutch says like, yeah, just take him, he's a thief, do whatever, because he's trying to save himself and he's trying to save the rest of the bunch. And then eventually they're like, oh, okay, well, I guess we'll go sacrifice ourselves for the sake of Angel. But
I think it's less heartlessness and more of like, hey, this is the only way we're going to survive.
Right. It's that pragmatic, like, well, if we have to sacrifice this guy, we will. And, there's a lot of that sacrifice going on. Early on, one of those kind of nameless members, they get away from the initial bank robbery, but he's severely injured, and William Holden just mercy kills him.
Yeah, he's blinded, and there's nothing else you can do. But I like all those elements. It adds to the kind of starkness of emotion there.
Right. No, I agree. I like it too. I mean, I like, it's sickening at times. You're like, oh wow, these guys are really fucked up. But that's part of what the movie is. And going back to women, as we said, we mentioned the human shield aspect in that final shootout. I believe it's Dutch, like, just grabs a woman and just straight up uses her as a literal human shield, like holding her in front of him so she can get shot and he can, make it to the next place he's going. So no remorse from these people at all.
Nope.
All right. Dave, you have anything to add here?
I really love the music here, and one of my favorite moments was when during one of those big shootouts, I think it was the last one, they kind of pull away to show that the mariachi music is diegetic and they're actually there playing. And you guys were talking about some of the big filmmakers that were inspired by Peckinpah. Maybe George Miller and Mad Max Fury Road with the Doof Warrior, that actually being in the sequence, in the action sequence. So yeah, that's just something I thought of.
Yeah, no, I agree. Jerry Fielding did a great job. He had said, like, if you listen to the music a nod against the film. It sounds like a romantic comedy score or love story score. It's pretty cool. So.
Yeah, but it works well. I mean, sometimes you get that juxtaposition and you're like, what are they doing with this? But it all fits together here.
Yep.
So should we rate this, Jason, out of 5 human shields?
5 yeah, sure. 5, whatever you want, Josh. 5 mass murders at the OK Corral, 5 human shields. Gets 3.5 from me, but the best thing I could say about it is like I'm already looking forward to watching it again to see to learn even more.
Yeah, I'm gonna give it a 3.5 as well. And I think I rated it higher the first time that I saw it, however many years ago. I think I was a little more just like wowed by its existence, and maybe coming into it now, I knew that aspect and I was more attuned to some of the faults. But overall, it's very good, and I was happy to watch it again. And certain parts of it are like 5-star moments. Just especially those set pieces are just absolutely astonishingly good. So 3.5 from me. Dave, how would you rate this?
I'm also going 3.5, and I think I've said this on the show before, but Westerns just aren't really my genre. 3.5 is kind of my high end, and so this is one of the better ones I've seen.
All right. Do you have a favorite Western?
That's a good question. I'm gonna have to think about that.
Blazing Saddles.
Yeah, sure. Yeah, let's go with that.
That sounds right for Dave.
Yeah.
So we'll come back and talk about the legacy of the Wild Bunch. Welcome back to Awesome Movie Year. In this episode of our season on the films of 1969, we're talking about Jason's pick, The Wild Bunch. And legacy-wise, as we're kind of alluding to, while the critical response was maybe a little mixed initially, now this is really considered one of the greatest movies ever made. This is on a million different lists from various institutions. Although I guess it was on the Sight and Sound list in 2012 and did not make the mark in the more recent 2022 version.
It's on the long list. It's on the long list.
Okay, yeah.
So, and it's on the AFI 100 greatest films list. So, but who cares, right? It's that was what was fascinating for me, and why I kind of, we always talk about placing it in context of when it came out, just like the idea of, like, you keep using the word revolutionary and influential, and how many new techniques, and these were done because they needed to be done to tell the story. They weren't just there for no reason.
Right. And I think this did, you said Peckinpah was kind of in director's jail here, and he had a rocky career, certainly going forward, and had a lot of clashes with his various collaborators and had alcohol issues. But this movie definitely got him back in the spotlight, and the Westerns that he made after this, like Pat Garrett and Billy the Kid and Bring Me the Head of Alfredo Garcia and The Ballad of Cable Hogue, all took on this kind of revisionist standpoint, and he was able to to take more risks with the Westerns that he made after this versus the ones he made before this, like Ride the High Country, which I watched and is like an effective film and well acted, but it's definitely more in that stodgy traditional Western mode. And so he became, I think, one of the key directors of the Western because he pushed it into this transitional period.
And I think, there's many filmmakers who owe him a debt of gratitude for the operatic violence that he portrays. And, when you think of violence on screen, you think of Peckinpah. He got the nickname Bloody Sam. And like I said, to me, the third act in Straw Dogs is the height of all that.
Yeah, I haven't seen Straw Dogs in a while, but it certainly is. It is also a thing that's kind of shocking to watch even now. I enjoyed The Getaway in part because it's a little more lighthearted. It's got the kind of romance between Steve McQueen and Ali MacGraw, and it's got that violence, and it's definitely got a lot of moments where you're like, oh, this is sweet. Oh, wait, no, this is sort of awful. But the overall result is more pleasant, maybe, and so I enjoyed that about it.
Well, Josh, I'm glad you enjoyed that.
Thank you. Major actors in this, as you said, William Holden, such an important actor, and already at this point had been in these films like Sunset Boulevard and Sabrina, The Bridge on the River Kwai, which I love. This is such a good movie. Won his Oscar for Stalag 17. He had a bit of a resurgence after this. He was nominated again for an Oscar for Network, and was in The Towering Inferno, which was a huge hit. But both him and Robert Ryan, this is kind of close to the end of their careers. They both died pretty young, sadly. So there aren't a ton of credits for either of them after this, but this was certainly a late career highlight for both of them.
Yeah, I mean, dude, look, you can put Holden's top 4 or 5 movies against anyone in any actor ever, right? So that's pretty cool. Robert Ryan was nominated for Best Supporting Actor in Crossfire. He got this job because of his work in The Dirty Dozen. And I had mentioned, I think, if not on this podcast, on Piecing It Together, the 1973 film that's also, there's a chapter in Tarantino's book with Robert Duvall called The Outfit, which was one of my top 10 first-time watches last year.
Nice. Yeah, I just happened to randomly watch Robert Ryan in a movie from Jason's favorite year, 1953, called Inferno, which was a really tough kind of noir film. And he plays this really not nice guy who is a millionaire who gets abandoned in the middle of the Mojave Desert after he breaks his leg, and his opportunistic wife decides to leave him to die, and his desire for revenge like fuels his survival. And he's really good in a role where in his scenes there's essentially no one else on screen, and he just has to like crawl through the desert. And it was a really impressive performance, and kind of a movie that I had not ever heard of, but was leaving Criterion, so I decided to check it out. So maybe he's a little underrated too.
Yeah, I think that sounds interesting, and another movie that you could remake and bring new life to. So
yeah,
Josh Edmond O'Brien, another legend who played Freddie Sykes, has an Academy Award, 2 Golden Globes, 2 stars on the Hollywood Walk of Fame. So he's been in, I think we talked about him in the Hunchback of Notre Dame episode, correct?
Yeah, maybe so. I mean, I love, like, how old do you think Edmond O'Brien was in this film?
I know. He was like 3 years older than William Holden or something like that.
Yeah, he was 53 when he played that character who looks like he's 100 years old. So I did love that. But yeah, he's an incredibly prolific actor. And of course, Ernest Borgnine, as you said, we talked about in our From Here to Eternity episode. And I think one of the reasons, you were alluding to why we don't take him as seriously is because he had such a long career, as opposed to William Holden and Robert Ryan, who died relatively young and were preserved sort of in their heydays. Borgnine worked so steadily for so long, well into his 90s, and was definitely one of these actors late in his career who would pretty much do anything that you would hire him to do. And so he was in a lot of not good stuff, but he was so jovial, and he always had great like talk show appearances and stuff. And I think maybe that made people underrate his serious abilities as an actor, but he's great in From Here to Eternity, and he's great here.
I agree. So you have Holden, Borgnine, Edmond O'Brien, and then Ben Johnson, who won an Academy Award for The Last Picture Show, which I think is an amazing movie. So 4 heaters in this, just from the award-winning standpoint. Then you have, someone like Warren Oates, who's a well-known actor who worked with Peckinpah a lot and became like a cult hero for movies like Two-Lane Blacktop.
Yeah, I mean the cast here is full, even in these really small parts. Is full of these actors that are recognizable later on: Strother Martin, L.Q. Jones, Bo Hopkins. I mean, all these people. Alfonso Arau, who is like a major Mexican filmmaker. Right. So many people show up in this movie that you don't even realize are going to be there, and it's like, oh, this is a huge, important cinematic figure who's in here.
I agree, sir.
So anything else you want to mention about the legacy of this film?
And we should mention that Waylon Green and Roy Sickner were the other writers on this thing. And Green wrote another one of our favorite movies, Sorcerer, from 1977.
Yeah, another big tough guy movie. And I think you could put William Friedkin in that canon of kind of tough guy directors.
100%. Yeah. And people who were influenced by Peckinpah. I mean, you watch The French Connection. Come on.
Yeah, absolutely. So that is The Wild Bunch, and that is this episode of Awesome Movie Year. You can have a shootout with us online and on social media.
Just online, please. Nowhere else. We're at awesomemovieyear.com, Awesome Movie Year on Facebook and Instagram, Awesome Movie Pod on someone should shoot that platform for a while. I'm Jason Harris Comedy, or Jay Harris Comedy on all the socials. Eat This Comedy. We're back, baby, doing shows here, Colorado. Come find us, and go for Jason on Letterboxd.
You can find some old stuff from me at joshbellhateseverything.com, including something I think I wrote up when I saw this movie the first time from 15 plus years ago or whatever. I am at Josh Bell Hates Everything on Facebook, at Signal Bleed on X, Twitter, as well as on Blue Sky and on Letterboxd. And if you're on Letterboxd and you watch this movie or any of the movies that we talk about, tag your review Awesome Movie Year. We'd love to know what you think about any of the movies we cover on the show. And you can check out our producer, David Rosen's awesome podcast, Piecing It Together.
Check out Piecing It Together, where I just use straw dogs as a puzzle piece. See how Awesome Movie Year expands my horizons. But you could find it anywhere you listen to podcasts, and follow us on social media at Piecing Pod.
Jason, what's in our next episode?
Josh, we're going to a different festival, Venice this time, because Sundance wasn't around. We're going to a little director known as Federico Fellini. Have you heard of him, Josh?
I think I have.
Oh, well, if not, his name's in the title of this film. It's Fellini's Satyricon.
So tune in next time for Fellini's Satyricon, and thanks for listening to Awesome Movie Year.
Thank you for listening to Awesome Movie Year. Make sure to follow Awesome Movie Year on Facebook, at Awesome Movie Pod on Twitter, and at Awesome Movie Year on Instagram. And if you like the show, review us and rate us with 5 stars on Apple Podcasts.
An All Points West production, produced by David Rosen in Las Vegas.